Okay, so this is the final of 3 videos we've done as part of the Politics Explained Edexcel A-Level Politics essay writing course on political ideas and how to answer these 24-mark ideologies questions in Edexcel A-Level Politics. We've had a look at overall how to structure your answer. We've had a look at evaluation, and what we're going to look at now is the main paragraphs, looking at knowledge AO1 and analysis AO2. So as discussed when we looked at the essay writing structure in the first video on political ideas, each of your main paragraphs in political ideas should focus on one key area of agreement or disagreement within the ideology and explain it in detail. And to do well, you should explain in detail not only what the ideology and different strands of the ideology believe and what they think, what their beliefs are, but really explain why they believe it. And in doing so, you'll be linking to the core principles, which is really important as well, whenever relevant. So you really want to explain why they think something, and that's where you're going to get your more detailed explanation. That's really important, picking up those AO1 and AO2 marks. When explaining agreements or disagreements within the ideology, your writing should be strand-led, not thinker-led. So I mentioned this in the first video as well. So the focus should really be on what the different strands think and how they agree or disagree. And then the thinkers you should then think of as examples of the strand to demonstrate what a strand thinks, but you shouldn't lead it by based on one disagreement. Is that Hobbes disagrees with Rand, for example? It needs to be strand-led. So one example, one disagreement is that traditional conservatives disagree with the New Right. Then explain traditional conservatism and maybe bring in Hobbes as an example. Then explain the New Right and maybe bring in Rand as an example. So it needs to be focused on the strand and explaining what they think and how they agree or disagree, and the thinkers are examples of that. And of course, you need to bring in these thinkers. You need to bring in at least 2 key thinkers in each essay. Of course, I recommend much more than that. Try and do at least 4 in every essay, and try and get to 5 if you're aiming for the A star for almost every question. But it needs to be strand led, not led by the thinkers. So the agreements need to be led by the strands, and the disagreements not by the thinkers. So we can first have a look at agreement paragraphs, and effectively what you're going to want to do is start by clearly introducing the specific point of agreement using the terms of the question. You should then explain in detail how there's agreement, why the ideology beholds this belief, and that's where you can get some of that detail in, explain why I said it's really important, and why this point of agreement is important to the ideology. And in doing so, you should link into the core principles of the ideology, and that's really important, especially for these agreement paragraphs, as well as demonstrating how there's agreement between different strands of the ideology, and focusing on really explaining why they agree on a point, including by drawing on other core principles. So even if it's about a core principle, on collectivism, for example, for socialism, a reason why they might support it is another principle, equality. So that's where, even if it's a question about a core principle, you can draw on these other core principles to explain why they hold such a belief. And you can also bring in thinkers to show either these kind of core beliefs or how a strand supports it, for example. Effectively bring in specific ideas of thinkers as examples. And then finally, you should use a summary sentence at the end to reiterate the point of the paragraph and link it back to your overall argument you've set out in the introduction, and it's going to be in your conclusion. So you should be very consistent with that overall argument. So say you've argued that agreement's more important in the introduction, in your agreement paragraph, you then at the end really restate, therefore this shows how there's major agreement within the ideology in relation to the economy, if it's that point. Or if you actually argue for disagreement, at the end of that agreement paragraph, you might say, as the rest of this essay demonstrate though, even though there's this broad agreement, they fundamentally disagree to a big extent as they disagree on the specifics of this disagreement. So even though there's disagreement on capitalism, they fundamentally disagree on the exact type of capitalism and reasons for supporting it, as I'll demonstrate in the rest of this essay, and therefore they disagree to a large extent. So you're linking it back. So it's not a mini conclusion in the same ways in those 30-mark essays, but you are bringing some evaluation and linking it back to your overall argument that's in your introduction and in your conclusion. You've got an example A-star agreement paragraph here. So as I've said, this is very much a high A-star standard. You don't need to write this much, and could even cut out the property rights section, which I've highlighted in red, and still do well. But again, pause this or go to get the PDFs on the Politics Explained website to have this in detail. But what we start with effectively is clearly stating the agreement. A highly important agreement among conservatives in relation to the economy is they all strongly support capitalism and property rights, which are consistent with the conservative principles of pragmatism and an organic society. We're then really explaining why they support capitalism effectively. Firstly, due to pragmatism. So we're linking it into that other core principle. It's the most practical and efficient economic system, and here we're bringing in a thinker to support that, because Oakeshott provides a really good justification for the conservative support of capitalism. We then also bring in another reason why they support it, looking at an organic society, how capitalism is seen as consistent with the idea of an organic society and natural trading between people in communities, and then we're bringing in how the new right support that. And we're bringing in Rand as a little bit of an example there. We're then going into the kind of a very second part of our core agreement, looking at property rights and doing exactly the same, introducing how there's that key agreement, why they support it. So again, this is in red. You wouldn't necessarily need to include this, but it's good to include it if you're looking to really push up to those top grades. So explaining why they support it, and bringing in some of the strands, linking in to some of those core principles, and we've got here demonstrating it by looking at the new right and looking at One Nation conservatism. We've actually got some real world examples here. These are not very important actually for core political ideas. Don't fixate on them too much, but for some specific points they can be useful. And then at the end, we've got that summary sentence. So overall, there is therefore a clear economic agreement among conservatives in relation to supporting capitalism and property rights. As this remainder of this essay will demonstrate, however, these broad agreements are undermined not only by the level of state intervention they support within capitalism, but also the fact that the new right rejects core conservative beliefs, including pragmatism and tradition, and supports capitalism due to an ideological support for freedom. So we're pointing to the rest of the essay and saying, okay, even though there's this agreement, my overall essay is arguing that disagreement is more important. So as we're bringing in some of that evaluation, and it's going to, of course, going to be then consistent with the argument in our introduction and our conclusion. And then, by contrast, we're going to have a look then at disagreement paragraphs then, and it's very similar. You're going to start by clearly introducing the specific point of disagreement using the terms of the question. So, one key disagreement in relation to human nature. If there's a question about human nature, for example, is this. You're then going to start with one strand and explain in detail what their view is, why they hold this view, linking into the core principles if possible, and bringing in a thinker to support. So again, the thinker is the example of the strand here. You're then going to compare that, use comparative language, compare that with another strand to explain how they disagree. Really focusing on how there's disagreement between them and why, but again, explaining how that strand disagrees, bringing a thinker to support. And in some paragraphs, you want to do the same with a third strand. And exactly the same, you've got a summary sentence at the end, exactly the same as those agreement paragraphs. So this is example disagreement paragraph here. So we first got this key point, clear point in relation to the question. A key disagreement among socialists in relation to human nature is about whether common humanity can be realised within a capitalist system, or whether capitalism must be abolished for the intrinsically cooperative and sociable nature of humanity to flourish. So a clear point in relation to the question. It's about human nature, and it's a clear, specific point, really answering that question, highlighting a key disagreement straight away. We're then going into revolutionary socialists, explaining what they think, how they think capitalism needs to be abolished, why they think it, and bring in a couple of thinkers. You only do two, but we brought in two here, just I think it's relevant too. So we're quoting, explaining what the thinkers support, and using those thinkers as examples of the strand to show how revolutionary socialists hold this view. We're then comparing it with social democrats in the third way to explain how they disagree. Again, explaining how they disagree, why they disagree, and bringing an example for social democracy with Crosland, the thinker, as an example, and bring his specific thought on how he supported it. And again, at the end, we've got a summary kind of sentence or two, bringing it together and then linking it in to our overall argument. So we're there here because it's consistent with our argument in the introduction and conclusion that disagreement is more important. We're really driving it home. So overall, this shows how there is major disagreement between socialists in relation to common humanity under capitalism. This disagreement is highly significant and undermines their broad agreement on common humanity, as revolutionary socialists would argue that the other strands don't support common humanity at all if they can believe it can be achieved within a capitalist framework. So really explaining and linking it into our overall argument about socialism and human nature, and really driving home the point. The final thing we're going to have a look at then is just some key tips to get an A-star in political ideas essays. There's nothing really different you want to do compared to what we've gone through. It's effectively just doing it all really well. So some key points. If you're looking to get the A-star, you should be doing all of these really, really well. And that's firstly really focusing on explaining why an ideology or strand supports a particular point, and knowing and being able to explain the detail well is really, really important for these essays. And this will often mean, as I said, you're going to be bringing in core principles and explaining why they're important, and lead an ideology or lead a strand to support a particular view. You should also be able to bring in thinkers effectively to support your points. Quotes aren't necessarily that important, but being able to explain the specific views of a thinker and how they this demonstrates a view of a strand is important. So, and sometimes quotes are useful in doing so. By far the most important point for getting the A star is evaluating really well. Have a clear and well-justified evaluation that really evaluates. AO3 is the kind of assessment objective that students consistently do the worst at, and you not only need to have a clear answer to the question, you need to really justify it well and explain, as we went through in the last video. And the final two key points then, picking your points well. So you make sure you want to cover some key agreements or disagreements in relation to the topic. So if it's on the economy, you can't miss out their agreement on capitalism, for example, or disagreement on capitalism. You need to make sure that effectively you're covering some of the key agreements and disagreements, not missing out some major ones. And make sure that you're always focused on comparing the strands and thinking about the ideology as a whole and how there's agreement or disagreement. So using that comparative language about how they agree in those agreement paragraphs and how there's that agreement on key principles or ideas, and the comparative language in the disagreement paragraphs about how they fundamentally disagree. So yeah, that was the final video in the Politics Explained essay writing course looking at political ideas. Look at all the previous videos on the course as well for 30 markers and source questions, and we're also going to be bringing out a few videos soon on 12 markers, so wait for those as well. They'll be before the second and third, well, definitely before the third exam this year. So I hope you found that useful, and let me know if you've got any comments or questions in the comment section below.